History as it happens, April 29th, 2021. McCarthyism Redux.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Like the 1950s Red Scare, Donald Trump's election conspiracies vilify powerful internal enemies. They didn't merely steal the election, they're trying to hijack your country. And if we believe public opinion polls, the Stop the Steal movement has a receptive audience. The hidden communists of yesteryear are the fake news media and radical leftists of today. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal.
It's November 23rd, 1953.
From New York City, you're about to hear an address by Joseph R. McCarthy, United States Senator from Wisconsin, and Chairman of the United States Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Senator McCarthy.
Good evening, fellow Americans. Last Monday night, a former president of the United States, while attempting to explain away his promotion of a communist spy, made a completely untruthful attack upon...
On national radio and television, the feared Senate Inquisitor, just months after obtaining his committee chairmanship, delivered an unhinged attack against Truman and Eisenhower. The charge, coddling communists. For McCarthy, tantamount to treason.
Truman defined what he called was McCarthyism. The definition was identical, word for word, comma for comma, with the definition adopted by the Communist Daily Worker, which originated the term McCarthyism.
As usual, the communist rank and file were aided and abetted by those on high. In this case, two presidents of the United States.
Are we going to continue to send perfume notes following the style of the Truman-Atchison regime? Or are we going to take the only position?
We know how Joseph McCarthy's story ends. Censured by the Senate in 1954, dead 3 years later from liver failure. If McCarthy trafficked in rumor and innuendo searching for communist traitors who didn't exist, American anti-communism was real. It permeated society, from politics to entertainment.
Starring Dana Andrews in an exciting tale of danger and espionage. I was a communist for the FBI.
The quest to find commie infiltrators scream from the speakers of Americans' radios.
Washington calling David Harding, counter-spy. Washington calling David Harding, counter-spy.
Really entertaining stuff, huh? Well, before we go any further, we have to thank the University of Virginia's Miller Center for allowing us to use this audio from their online archive of the McCarthy era.
Washington calling David Harding.
So if you're wondering why I'm talking about McCarthyism, well, at first I had my doubts too, whether the 1950s Red Scare could teach us anything about Donald Trump's Stop the Steal campaign. Seemed like a stretch, right? Well, there are, of course, big differences between the two conspiracy theories, and a major scholar of 20th century America will be here in a moment to talk about them.
The fact that the Soviet Union was an enemy was real. There are differing interpretations of what kind of enemy it was. There were some who, at the time, who thought it was a revolutionary kind of enemy that had to be stopped at all costs.
That is Gary Gerstle, Paul Mellon Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge. Our conversation covers the similarities and differences between then and now. And I think you'll find it compelling, given the post-truth society many people believe we're living in these days.
Falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts? Alternative facts for the
conspiracy theories harm not only their targets, they poison their believers too. And that is where we begin today, with the story of a Christian family from suburban Atlanta. They loved Donald Trump and traveled to Washington for his January 6th rally to stop the steal. They are the Cuas, residents of Milton, Georgia, and now they regret making that trip. 18-year-old Bruno Cua is the youngest person facing federal charges in the rampage at the Capitol. We now see that it was all lies, say his parents, who are renouncing the Stop the Steal campaign. They admit they were conned, but Bruno's legal troubles are serious. He faces a dozen charges, some of which are felonies, and if convicted, he could face prison time. His potential punishment for trying, as he believed at the time, to save his country from internal enemies who had stolen the election. For more on this story, we're going to check in with the Washington Times national security reporter Rowan Scarborough, who's been following the case. Rowan, welcome.
Good to be with you, Martin.
So, Rowan, let's start with what we know about the Cua family. What can you tell us about them?
They are mail order for Trump. They are the kind of Trump voter that got him over the top in 2016. They live about 30 miles outside Atlanta in a very posh environment of 3 acres and a large colonial home and their own chickens and their own horses. And he's an executive. He worked in the hotel industry for a number of years, a vice president. She is a trained veterinarian who decided to switch to becoming a homeschooler for their 3 kids. And part-time, she's a photographer. The oldest of their children is Bruno, who went to Washington on January 6th with his parents. They're churchgoers, they're prosperous, and in short, they're the kind of people who would be so devoted to Trump, perhaps, that they would buy in to his sales job that the election was stolen, that I won in a landslide. And that's what took them to the Stop the Steal rally on January 6th. Their complete commitment to Donald Trump.
Do we know about the family's political leanings prior to supporting Trump? Were they politically active? Is that something we know about?
Well, just bedrock conservatives. They live in a conservative area. They took to Trump right away because, his message of America first rung true with them. Bruno, the son, got so into Trump that he put a Trump flag on his pickup truck and would drive it around town sometimes with an air horn to let people know that he was an unabashed Trump supporter.
So how did Bruno, 18 years old, get so caught up in the Stop the Steal campaign?
Mostly social media. He had accounts at Parler, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and of course, Donald Trump, even before the election, was predicting that the election would be stolen because he didn't like this big increase of absentee ballots. Bruno was reading all this continuously, and his emotional attachment to Trump heightened after November 3rd when Trump lost and he began the Stop the Steal movement. And Bruno, through social media, became totally committed. He would read Trump's tweets, and then he would comment about them on Instagram or to direct messages to his friends about how important it was to stop the steal, to reverse this, because the election was stolen. The family attended rallies already for Trump in Georgia, but this really got them going to the point where the family committed to driving to Washington on January 6th in their truck to attend this rally.
They didn't consider themselves part of any of the groups that were represented on January 6th, like QAnon or some of these other fringe groups, right?
That's right. These are what I would call mainstream, Make America Great Again, MAGA people. And they had no interest when people were marching to the Capitol. And it became clear that this was turning into more than a protest as people started to get closer and closer to the doorways that were guarded by the police. They stopped. The parents stopped, and they had no intention of going any farther. But it was Bruno who wanted to get a closer view, not telling them what his intentions were, so they said, go ahead. What happened to Bruno? He joined the mob. He pushed his way through into the door, committing a crime right there. And he had brought a baton with him for self-protection because sometimes Antifa shows up or counter-protesters. And so that made it doubly wrong because he broke in with the mob and then he has essentially a weapon in his hand.
So, Rowan, this episode is about conspiracy theories and the power of lies. The Cua family has since come out and admitted that they were duped, that the Stop the Steal campaign was a big lie, and now they are regretful of going along with it, right?
Yes. That's what attracted me to the story when I went through the case file, that these committed supporters of Donald Trump finally saw after January 6th that they had been duped by the Stop the Steal allegations. They had crying sessions. They did more research into what happened, trying to think, how did they get to this spot? And they went over the research that had been done so far in the election, and they came to the conclusion that the evidence is just not there. What Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and MyPillow and Donald Trump were selling them just never materialized. And they feel disillusioned and somewhat like they were tricked.
So it may be too late to help their son, but they have dropped the Stop the Steal idea.
Which is only logical, because if you look at Trump's speech on January 6th, he made 37 separate allegations of election fraud, and none of them have been proven. In fact, some of them have been proven to be just simply wrong. For example, Wisconsin lost 100,000 ballots, and that came from a private mail delivery truck driver who went on TV to make that allegation. Well, it turns out that came from some conversation he had with a postal worker who was just repeating some rumors he heard on the internet. And the truck driver took that as fact and just started spreading it on the airways, and the Inspector General for the Postal Service had to come in and look at it and found out that there's just no evidence that 100,000 ballots were ever lost.
Rowan Scarborough, thank you for the update. Washington Times national security reporter. The Cua's experience shows us what happens when conspiracy theories implode. It can be ruinous. Now the family is calling Stop the Steal what it is, a big lie. So what should we make of a new Reuters Ipsos poll? 55% of Republicans believe Joe Biden's victory was the result of illegal voting or rigging. 60% of Republicans believe the election was stolen. These are fantasies, but they didn't come out of nowhere, and neither did McCarthyism in the 1950s. So, as promised, Gary Gerstle, Paul Mellon Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge, and he's the author of Liberty and Coercion, The Paradox of American Government from the Founding to the Present. Gary Gerstle, we're honored to have you.
Good to be here with you, Martin.
So, Gary, when I started thinking about comparisons between McCarthyism and Donald Trump's Stop the Steal campaign, I was having some difficulty making a connection. But I think both are based on this notion, that internal enemies are trying to undermine our society and culture, to steal the country from us. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you're reading that connection correctly. And part of what fuels the anger and rage in McCarthy movement and also in the Stop the Steal movement is the conviction that there are internal enemies seeking to undermine American life. And the fact that they are internal enemies makes the danger more serious, more deadly, because these are people who should know better. They know the highways and byways of American life. They know how to penetrate American institutions. So the fact that they are internal enemies is a big part of both movements. We have to look at the framing of these enemies a little more closely, however. There is an enemy usually in both cases in low places. That would be communists in the early 50s, and the equivalent, I would say, would be non-white voters today. Groups that predominantly white majorities of Americans today are very suspicious of. And in the 1950s, suspicion fell on communists, many of whom were urban ethnics who had not been in the United States that long. So they also were considered outsiders of sorts. But crucially, in both cases, they are perceived as being abetted from people on high, from people who are not outsiders, but insiders in American life, people who have been reared in privilege with full access to the opportunities of American life. And what makes these moments so dangerous in the eyes of those who see these conspiracies is that those down low are being assisted by those on high. And that coalition makes the threat particularly deadly. In the case of McCarthy, those on high were people like Alger Hiss, part of the Protestant majority, educated at the best schools, who becomes a traitor to his country, should have known better. Another high in the government, Dean Acheson, is accused of being soft on communism. Another case of a member of a Protestant elite who should have known better. In the world today, the people who are feared as voters are perceived as being assisted by elites in Washington, by newspaper elites, by academic elites, who also should know better, who also have been given access to the full possibilities and benefits of American life. And it's the position of these elite members close to the levers of government and close to the levers of power that makes the challenges of the outsiders so dangerous.
Well, if you listen to Donald Trump's January 6th speech, which we should note came after he spent months trying to delegitimize the elections, he does offer up his usual list of internal enemies, powerful forces like the fake news media, for instance, who were apparently conspiring with average voters to steal the election. You know, to my eyes and ears, it sounded crazy, but it got at least some members of his audience into a frenzy. It was potent enough to attack the Capitol building.
Absolutely. And the anger directed at Raffensperger in Georgia, for example, we might regard him, and some people in America do regard him, as a very honorable civil servant doing his duty. But from the perspective of Trump and the people in his legions who he was able to convince, he was seen as a tool of the true insurrection, which was not the January 6th insurrection, but those who were seeking to undermine America's electoral system. And if you can convince people that it's not just poor blacks in Atlanta trying to cast their votes illegally, but they are being assisted by people in positions, crucial positions of power, then you can immediately see why the conspiracy begins to seem so immense and so threatening. And at that point, all measures in the eyes of those who have these sentiments become justifiable, because these people really do begin to think that the future of the republic is imperiled, and the peril is immediate, it is close, it is at hand, and it must be stopped by all means necessary.
We're going to bounce back between past and present a bit in this conversation. Let's look at McCarthyism again. There was a real-world context to it. Communism was real. There were spy cases, the Alger Hiss case, the Rosenbergs. China fell to Mao's insurgency. The Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb in the late 1940s. So McCarthyism was built on a lie, but there was a real-world context there.
Yes, America had a real enemy in the world. These were the two new superpowers on the block. The old powers of the world which resided in Europe, England, Germany, France, had been destroyed by World War II. There was a serious vacuum of power and influence in the world. And suddenly you have these two countries with nuclear weapons trying to find their place, their footing, trying to find out if they can, in fact, coexist. They both possess nuclear weapons with the ability to annihilate each other and the planet. And making things worse is that the ideologies driving these two countries are diametrically opposed. And people in both countries, leaders in both countries, believe that the two superpowers cannot coexist. And so it's a very vexed world in which America is trying to find its footing. The fact that the Soviet Union was an enemy was real. There are differing interpretations of what kind of enemy it was. There were some who, at the time, who thought it was a revolutionary kind of enemy that had to be stopped at all costs. And there were others who thought that under Stalin's leadership and then Khrushchev, the Soviet Union was behaving a lot like world powers of previous centuries, looking to protect itself from invasion, looking to have a sanitary corridor around its borders, but not bent on world domination. So there are different interpretations of the kind of enemy it represented. But these two countries were enemies of each other, and the futures they imagined for themselves and the world were diametrically opposed. These were very difficult circumstances in which to govern both internally and externally.
And as mentioned, there were actual communist spies in our country.
Yes, the consensus is now that Alger Hiss was probably a spy. Julius Rosenberg is now thought to have been a spy or a courier for a spy. Ethel Rosenberg is thought not to have been, and she was put to her death because the prosecutors and the judge thought she would break for the sake of preserving one parent for their children. But she never broke and went to her death for the sake of her principles. There were other spies as well. Parts of the US government knew this from a series of cables between the Soviet Union and the American Communist Party that they intercepted. The Venona cables, which they did not reveal at the time, because to reveal them would have prompted the Soviet government to stop sending these messages. And spycraft of the time called for the continuation of these messages so the United States could continue to intercept them. So there were real spies and there was real espionage, but it's also true that McCarthy and those who were part of his anti-communist crusade were bent on attacking members of the Communist Party and their supporter, whether they were spies or not. So McCarthyism was not focused on espionage per se. It was focused on rooting out communists wherever they worked, government, Hollywood, defense plants, the Manhattan Project, public schools, rooting them out, rooting out the influence not just of themselves as people, but the influence of their ideas. So many libraries were purged of books either written by communists or thought to be soft on communism. So a great chill settled on American society. And this was part of McCarthy's aim, not just to out the spies, but to out anyone who he had ascertained had or in the past had had some connection to the Communist Party.
So what would be the equivalent context, if there is one, and we should discuss the differences between McCarthyism and what we might call Trumpism, if we define in this context Trumpism as a worldview based on, in part, conspiracy theories. What is the equivalent conspiratorial mindset or larger context in which claims about election fraud and internal enemies today can thrive?
Well, I think the first thing to be said is that there is no real world equivalent to the Soviet Union confronting America today. America confronts no enemy with the power, the resolve, the world influence of the Soviet Union. There have been some who have tried to make Islamic radicals and terrorists into the new Soviet communist threat. Groups of Islamic radicals do pose a threat, but not anywhere close to what the communist movement of the 40s and 50s threatened. If you think of the amount of territory and the number of states controlled by communists in the late 40s and early 50s, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, some nations in Africa, some other nations in Asia, communist countries covered 1/3 of the territory of the earth and 1/6 of the population. There's nothing resembling that in the 21st century world, where American military power remains unchallenged. At some point, it will be challenged by China. But two things to say about China. China is not the threat that the Soviet Union was in the late 40s and early 50s. And secondly, whatever China is, it's not really communist anymore. It is going to be a rival of the United States, but it is not promoting global revolution and communist revolution wherever it goes. So the first thing to be said is that there is no real world equivalent. If I were to search for one as a basis for these conspiracy theories today, and something that was factually based, I would say the fear is America becoming a majority minority nation. And by that, I mean by 2050, America's population will be majority minority, majority non-white, majority of people not descended directly from the peoples of Europe. And irrespective of what American policies are between now and 2050, that demographic fact is baked in. No matter how many immigrants are deported, no matter how many walls and borders are built, this is a fact. And Trump understands it. And I think many of his supporters understand it. And it induces in them great fear. And there was an American First manifesto recently issued and then repudiated by the Republican Party that is quite explicit about this, which talks about having proper regard for America's Anglo-Saxon and European heritage and the special quality of that civilization. And if you allow for genuine majority voting, the majority of voters in every election at some point are going to be not white. And that is profoundly threatening to those who are part of Trump's legions. And so how do you deal with an unalterable fact of that sort? you have two mechanisms. One is to cry any election that goes against you as having been the product of fraud. The other is the Mitch McConnell strategy, which is that you use the Electoral College to your advantage. The Electoral College is meant to be a minority's check on majority rule. It turns out that only one of the 6 last Republican presidents who has run for office has won a majority of the popular vote. And yet, time and again, they have been elected president because of legal mechanisms of the Electoral College. So you either maneuver the Electoral College to guarantee that a minority will continue to rule, or else you begin to challenge the legitimacy of elections themselves, imagining that the only way something like this could be happening is if the election results are faked. But I think underneath the Trump movement, what's driving it is the fear that, and the knowledge, not just the fear, the knowledge of a coming fact that whites will form a minority of America's population by 2050. And to a big section of the American population, this is unacceptable because it represents the end of America as they know it and as they imagine it should be.
To what extent do you believe Stop the Steal flowed from some of the cultural trends we've seen on the right over the past couple of decades or more? For instance, media entertainers like Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck telling their large audiences not to trust the government, scientists, liberal academics, liberal history professors, the media. In other words, Trumpism came from something.
Absolutely. There's a political trend and there's a social media trend. The political trend has been building since the 1980s and 1990s. I think Rush Limbaugh went national in syndication, I think in 1989, I believe. I could be off a year or two, but not very far. That marked a new era of broadcasting. It was made possible by the end of the so-called fairness doctrine, which obligated media outlets, if they gave a view on politics to one side that was very partisan, they had to give something resembling equal time to the other side. That fairness doctrine is eliminated in the late 80s under Reagan, and it permits talk radio, Fox television, a whole media landscape that had not been possible before. And not only did it allow these kinds of accusations to be made endlessly by very charismatic hosts, and whatever you think of Limbaugh, he was tremendously good at what he did and tremendously persuasive, and people would listen to him 1, 2, 3 hours a day.
Yeah. Well, you could probably hear Rush Limbaugh during the time he was on at any place in the United States where you can get a radio frequency.
Yeah, tremendously successful at what he did. That was accompanied as part of the cable revolution with the fragmentation of the media landscape. When I was a kid, if you wanted to watch the news, you had 3 choices: CBS, NBC, ABC. You could not simply embrace the channel or the TV station that embraced your point of view. The cable revolution made a different world possible. You could just simply fill up all your hours of listening and watching with your favorite shows. And this went along, of course, with 24-hour broadcasting, endless news broadcasting. And so it had the effect of encasing groups of America in their bubbles. And this, I should add, is not simply true of the right, but it's true of the left. And it has made conversation across ideological barriers much more difficult than it ever had been. And the other element of this process is not based on media, but based on politics. There's been a radical element in the Republican Party since the 1990s. No more compromise, standing up for American principles. The New Deal state went far too far. The Great Society state went much too far. The Warren Court, the judiciary is out of control. Roll everything back. And Republicans were very successful electorally, but the leaders of the Republican Party, or a group of them, or the militants in their ranks, were often more radical than the GOP rank and file. And so it was often the case that the GOP rank and file was not willing to go as far as the GOP militants in terms of rolling back the New Deal state. It's fine to roll back civil rights law, but do you really want to get rid of Social Security? Most Republicans would answer that in the negative. So Republicans might have reacted by becoming more moderate, more pragmatic, by saying, listen, our base doesn't really want to go as far as we want to go. But instead they said that's not what's going on. What's going on is that Supreme Court justices appointed as Republicans are not doing their work. Congressmen and senators winning elections, promising things to us are not doing their work. We're going to hold them to account. We're going to enforce purity on them. They became more ideological. They became more purity-based. They became more like a sect than like a big assembly of a political party in the American tradition. And then they have to explain why, in the process of becoming more pure, more ideologically sacred, why they continue to fail to eliminate the deep state, why they continue to fail to uproot the kind of cultural liberalism they deplore. And so more and more, it becomes conspiracies on the part of people in high places who are undoing the will of the people and stabbing us in the back. Trump is a product of this. He did not create this moment. He just pushed it to the ultimate.
To what degree were these ideas fueled by simple partisanship? I mean, after all, Democrats had won yet another presidential election, the party's fifth in a row in 1948. And it seems that many Republicans were simply disgusted by not having the White House again.
Well, in electoral politics, that's an eternity. That's a whole generation of presidential contenders, or two generations of presidential contenders wiped out. So they did feel themselves to be in the wilderness, and there were younger congressmen angry about this, willing to try anything, one of them being Richard Nixon, as a congressman from California. And they found the accusation of Democrats being soft on communism as being a very effective tool with which to beat their Democratic opponents. And they wielded that club ruthlessly, none more ruthlessly or effectively than Joe McCarthy himself. There was definitely a partisan element to this. However, the Democrats engaged in their own anti-communist crusade and tactics. Truman began it even before the 1948 election. And as I said earlier, they had a real world rival pledged to their destruction.
That's right. I mean, the idea that Truman was soft on communism, the historical record does not really support that.
Yes, he was not soft on communism. So I think this is not, even though partisanship definitely played an element, one cannot understand McCarthyism simply as a club used by Republicans to beat the Democrats. In other words, there would have been a Red Scare even if the Democrats had carried both houses of Congress, and even if the Democrats had won in 1952. It should be said, as we compare McCarthyism to what's going on to today, the GOP ultimately did contain and disarm McCarthy. He died an alcoholic, isolated man in the mid-50s. It's also worth pointing out that McCarthy was not Trump in this way, even though there's a direct connection between McCarthy and Trump in the figure of Roy Cohn, who was McCarthy's indispensable attorney assistant and who Trump long regarded as his mentor in the hurly-burly world of New York politics. It's important to recognize the differences between McCarthyism and Trumpism. The equivalent of Trumpism in 1952 would have been not Eisenhower or Taft winning the election, but McCarthy winning the election as president of the United States.
That's right.
Then we can imagine a more parallel situation. So McCarthy was very powerful, but he was one senator, and Eisenhower, in his own way, was pledged to corralling and destroying him. It's not clear who's going to corral and contain the Trump forces. Anti-communism remained a potent element of American life in the 50s and 60s, but the McCarthyist version of this was ebbing by the mid-50s. Institutions of American life were repudiating its worst excesses. The question for America in the 21st century is that who is going to be the force that does that in regard to Trump? And what's been so striking about the Republican Party is its either unwillingness or its inability to corral Trump, to corral the conspiracy theories. But in the 50s and early 60s, were corralled and disciplined for a time by a determined GOP. That determined GOP, by determined, I mean determined to corral its worst tendencies on the right. I'm not sure that any longer exists in American life today.
Is it just something about the human condition, whether you're on the right or left, where it's so easy to find perceived enemies to rail at?
I think there is something about the human condition. Fear of conspiracy is a ubiquitous force in the world. It's not particular to America. Richard Hofstadter, a famous historian, wrote a famous essay called The Paranoid Style of American Politics. Elements of many countries' politics have paranoid elements to them. Whether there's anything particular about America that makes it prone to conspiracy, I think is an interesting question. I think that the origins of America lie with, or one of the origins of America lie with Puritan zealots who believe that a papal conspiracy was out to destroy them and the world. And we forget how potent a sentiment anti-Catholicism was in American life for hundreds of years, now thankfully gone, but very, very potent. But the origins of America among a group of zealots, schismatics, feeling themselves to be a small remnant and the world conspiring against them. This goes back to the very beginning of, even before the American Republic, the very beginning of the settlement of New England, at least. This was not true of Virginia, but certainly true of New England. We can see how deeply baked in these ideas are to American life. And you combine that with the American suspicion growing out of the American Revolution with aristocracy, monarchy, court intrigue, the emphasis put on common sense and the value of the ordinary citizen, and then how to explain in an American democracy where so often ordinary people seem to be getting screwed for some reason or another, or not partaking fully of the American dream or the possibilities of American life. Why is that happening in a country in which the people are supposed to rule? In that democratic dispensation being unfulfilled or periodically disappointed, I think we can find additional roots of a tendency to see conspiracy in high places and to rob the ordinary folk of America of their birthright as part of a great democratic experiment. This definitely infuses the ranks of the allegiance of Trump supporters. And we have to say that what everyone thinks about the case they're making about the steal, and I think it's a manufactured lie. It's a big lie. But I do grant that millions and millions of people who voted for Trump do believe that the election was stolen. And I also think the effects of the 2008 financial crash and Great Recession are still with us. A lot of ordinary people in America of all colors have suffered a great deal. Tremendous economic inequality in American life. Tremendous sense that, and we have statistics to back this up now, that the children of today's grown-ups are not going to have the same opportunities that their parents or grandparents had. All these feed into conspiracies in high places because this is not supposed to happen in America, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Historian Gary Gerstle, thank you for those insights. You know, something that occurs to me as we wrap this up is it's now common in our country to see our political opponents not simply as wrong on this or that issue, but as our enemies trying to undermine American life. It's no wonder why so many across the political spectrum are quick to believe the worst about others. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
It's come to my attention that President Biden intends to have the United States formally recognize the Armenian genocide, becoming the first sitting U.S. president to do so.
Suddenly, 1915 is relevant again. President Biden, Turkey, and the Armenians, and why it matters. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.